Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Nadi Abusaada. Nadi is an architect, urbanist, a historian, and is currently an Aga Khan postdoctoral fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also known as MIT, which is probably easier. Nadi's PhD, Building Urban Palestine, Jaffa and Nablus, 1860 and 1940, has been recently completed at the University of Cambridge, and is basically examining the history of urban planning and urban governance in late Ottoman and Mandate Palestine. Nadi published a number of articles, some of them also in the Jerusalem Quarterly, which we're going to talk about, particularly focusing on the Arab exhibition in the 1930s, and recently a very fascinating article about archaeology as essentially, what is under Jerusalem. Nadi is also the co-founder of Arab Urbanism, a global network dedicated to historical and contemporary urban issues in the Arab region. And as I mentioned earlier, his writings have been featured in a number of international publications, including the Architecture Review, the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, and, of course, the Jerusalem Quarterly. First of all, Nadi, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. Thanks for having me.
So, Nadi, you are now in the US. You did your PhD in the UK. But obviously, the most important question, and the first one that I ask all the time is, what is your Jerusalem? What is your relationship with the city?
Good question. Well, I was born in Jerusalem, actually. But I hold the West Bank ID. So now to go to Jerusalem, I have to apply to permits. But yeah, I mean, I've been visiting the city quite frequently, or at least I try every time I'm back in Palestine. Now I'm back in Ramallah, and I'm yet to visit Jerusalem, hopefully sometime next week.
Well, that's great. And hopefully, inshallah, you'll be able to visit. I'm interested in understanding how you got to work in sort of the urban studies and the urban aspects of Jerusalem, particularly since you're merging different approaches, architecture, urbanism, and of course, history. How did you develop that particular interest about Jerusalem?
Right. So I'm an architect by training. So that's my vantage point into history. And yeah, I guess for me, as you know, a Palestinian architect, before trying to intervene in the built environment, I guess it was essential for me to try and understand the many layers of intervention that preceded myself and my generation of architects. So it started with starting a master's at Cambridge back in 2016. Where, I started to really explore some of the themes around urban planning and governance and how that influences the built environment. And then because, master's programs are too short, it had to extend into a PhD. And then I ended up doing 4 more years of research into more urban history from an architectural lens. So really, almost accidental by start, but then it really became the main thing I'm working on right now.
I would say that architects in general, in my mind, are those who are planning, but also there's some way fantasizing about buildings and how cities should look like. So they imagine the future building. But you wrote a brilliant chapter in a very interesting volume. So you talked about urban encounters or imaging the city in Mandate Palestine, which is more about the idea, like sort of the image themselves. And the volume is is a collection of very, very interesting chapters published by Karen Sanchez and Sarizan Anariri, who has been also a guest of a podcast, Imaging and Imagining Palestine. So I want to start from there because I thought that it's very interesting about this idea of imaging Palestine during the British Mandate. And I was wondering, how was imaged, I can't even say the word, I don't know exactly how the word would be, Palestine under the British?
Yeah, I guess the main point of that article was to try and rethink about how do we write the history of photography in Mandate Palestine. And precisely because I come from an architectural background, I was mostly interested in photography that's related to cities and the built environment. And one of the main things I was trying to say is that photography was not just an instrument of representation of the built environment. It wasn't just an exterior thing to the built environment itself. It was actually a tool that colonial architects and planners used to intervene within these fabrics. So I was really trying to focus on how different architects and planners, one of them is Charles Ashby, for instance, who was a chief planner in Jerusalem right after World War I. And he was sketching his proposed panoramas of the city over photographs of the city, panoramic photographs of the city. So it's really photography for him is a way of seeing the city. And of course, they understood that way of seeing as a more neutral way of seeing the city. And then they would impose and sketch over these photographs. So it's really trying to understand the development of these cities through photography and the different colonial lenses that informs how photography is used.
You talked about Charles Ashby, that is probably one of the most prominent British planners in Palestine and certainly in Jerusalem ever since the end of World War I and by the time the British took over. I was wondering, what is your assessment as an architect of the work of the like of Charles Ashby and others that have been employed by the British, particularly in the early British Mandate period, but perhaps also looking at the long duration, so the 30 years of British rule?
Right. I mean, Ashby was one of multiple British colonial architects hired during the Mandate period. And actually, he was one of the first to take over the planning of Jerusalem after the Macklin plan. And yeah, I mean, Ashby comes from that arts and crafts movement, which we know the history of too well when it comes to Britain, but we know very little of when it comes to how it was also a global movement, or a movement that influenced global experimentations in architecture and planning. And of course, that intersects with the colonial history, and that particularly in the case of Ashby. Ashby was, a particularly interesting figure. He has this notebook where he comments on his duration in Palestine. It's called the Palestine Notebook. It's in his personal collection, which is at King's College in Cambridge. And it's really fascinating because he's a romantic socialist in some way. He's trying to create an idyllic understanding of Jerusalem, but at the same time, he has the very practical task of actually proposing a plan for the city. And of course, he's the main engine behind the pro-Jerusalem Society, which Ronald Storrs established right after the military occupation of Jerusalem. So he proposes quite a few plans for the old city, and this is where it also intersects with the whole photography idea, because he's looking at the old city from the outside. He's not so much interested, although he documents a lot of the architectural fabric of the old city, but he's really interested in how you approach the city and what you see in Jerusalem immediately after arriving to the city. He's really, that's a big deal for him. So on one of the photographs, for instance, where you see the Ottoman clock tower, which was built in the era of Sultan Abdul Hamid II on his 25th anniversary, or the 25th anniversary of his reign. And then he draws a circle around that clock tower and an arrow, and then he writes, "This has to go." So he's this kind of planner that is trying to preserve a certain idea of what Jerusalem is. Mostly exterior. He doesn't mind demolishing shops, specifically Palestinian shops that were dotting the belt right around the old city. And then instead he proposes to turn it into a green space. And so, yeah, he's really interested in perspectival views, panoramic views of the city, not so much in local reactions to these plans, as was common for colonial architects more generally.
One of a general statement about Charles Ashby and that period is that the British were trying to make, particularly the old city, as some sort of an open-air museum. But I'm curious about this idea of preservation, because that's, you know, sort of this word that is highly used to define the work of these architects. But my feeling has always been that there was a sort of a preservation according to their own ideas and not necessarily about the city itself. So I was wondering, what is your take on this idea of preservation?
Yeah, I guess the question of preservation always raises another question, which is what ought to be preserved and what ought not to be preserved. So clearly, when someone like Ashby draws a circle around an Ottoman clock tower, he excludes that from his narrative of preservation. So that does not fit within the history that ought to be studied, that ought to be kept for future generations. So I guess that's my main issue, of course, with preservation in general. I think that applies to many other contexts besides Jerusalem. But particularly when we look at a colonial experience like that of Jerusalem, it becomes very partial. So yeah, I guess.
Well, the story goes that even David Ben-Gurion at some point made the comment that the walls of Jerusalem should have been demolished because they were not Jewish enough. At least understanding that effectively those walls, for the most part, had been built by the Ottomans, obviously on the basis of previous walls, but still they didn't represent this idea of the preservation of an ancient past. But certainly the clock tower, it's a very interesting example of sort of demolishing symbols, but not only of the Ottoman past, but also of modernity, which people were very much attached to, in favor of preserving a past that was ideal in the minds of the British. I just want to ask you something about the legacy. Today, visiting Jerusalem is quite an experience because obviously the city has mushroomed and is giant. And I use the word cementification in another interview because that's essentially what you experience driving into the city. It's like cement everywhere.
Right.
So there is that part. But when you focus on the old city and the surrounding, I was wondering to what extent we can still see and perceive a British legacy in terms of plans and architecture.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's important to distinguish when it comes to architecture is how we periodize architecture, right? Because not everything that was built during the British Mandate was necessarily a British legacy. And that was really the main point of my dissertation when I talk about late Ottoman and the British period, is that there are these artifacts of empire, whether it's the late Ottoman or the British, that are really, you know, significant, monumental, etc. But when it comes to most construction that takes place during these periods, it's usually, you know, residential architecture, because this is a period of great expansion of cities, suburbs are being built, cities going outside of their historical walls for the first time. So when it comes to the Mandate period, of course, the mushrooming outside the historic city, I mean, the British have influenced that in terms of planning roads, etc. But as an effort, it was mostly either Palestinian or, of course, the Jewish colonies, which were built from the late 19th century onwards. There are a few monumental constructions, especially on Jaffa Road from the 1930s and 40s, like the post office, like a few other, the Barclays Bank, etc. And of course, there's this whole green belt which surrounds the old city, which is still there more or less today. And of course, Jerusalem is where there's most British investment in matters of urban planning, along with Haifa. But when it comes to other cities throughout Palestine, you see that less and less there are really remainders of British colonial rule, at least in terms of architecture. In terms of planning, the widening of roads, etc., that still has some effect. Especially the planning that took place during the 1936 revolt. But that's a whole another topic that we can get into.
I was interested in an exhibition that took place in Istanbul, and unfortunately, due to COVID, I couldn't go, but I saw a few sort of short videos shot online where they presented the Ottoman heritage in Jerusalem. And I felt that it was an attempt to sort of appropriate that past. But again, this was like my reading, even considering that effectively, quite interestingly, there was no attempt to move forward from the late Ottoman era and to see how buildings, in particular hospitals and other institutions that had been built during the Ottoman period, developed in later times. And I was wondering if you had a chance to actually get acquainted with this exhibition, or what they did and what was the attempt.
I'm not familiar with the exhibition, but I have things to say about what you mentioned in terms of the appropriation of history and of the architectural legacy, but also history in general. I think there has, well, of course, the Ottoman history has seen quite a lot of revision in the past, I don't know, 30 years or so, probably even more, around the whole question of Ottoman modernity and writing the history of Ottoman modernity against that whole decline thesis, which is now very retired and all that. But I think there's a limitation to what Ottomanists or how Ottomanists still frame the Ottoman legacy in the Arab provinces, including a place like Palestine. Because while it is true that the late Ottoman period was a period of immense modernization, construction, development, that the direct involvement of Ottoman officials was not always there in matters of urban planning and construction. And actually local municipal councils, which were operating within the Ottoman structure, but still had some level of autonomy and were formed by local representatives and local populations, they had a major role in leading many of these constructions, and local populations financed them. So that aspect has to be looked at when we look at a building, and then asking, is this an Ottoman building or is it an Ottoman era building, right? And then there's the other question, which is the point you mentioned, that a lot of these buildings, we can't, it's more of a historiographical point, which is that we can't simply stop at World War I. It is true that a world was ruptured in World War I, but that's not the end of history. Many of these artifacts have much longer lives, right? So asking what happens to these buildings, to this legacy of late Ottoman modernization into the British Mandate period, I think is a question that's worthwhile asking. And you'll see that a lot of the buildings have been reappropriated. A lot of them became old centers. So a lot of the new centers that sprung as new urban centers in the late Ottoman period became old centers, and then new centers sprung in the 1930s and 40s. So this is a period of really rapid change, and to really understand that kind of change, we have to look across these different periodizations that political historians like to stick to.
Before moving to another aspect of your work, I'm curious about your take on recent attempts to digitally reconstruct buildings or entire neighborhoods around Jerusalem. There are different kind of projects. Some of them have been discussed here on the show. Jerusalem, we are here, which basically was the idea to use Google Maps technology and place Palestinian houses in some neighborhoods of Jerusalem. Others that are attempting to rebuild, for instance, the Mughrabi Quarter. But I was wondering, you know, you're an architect, you're dealing with real buildings. And so how do you see this idea of using virtual technology in order to actually reconstruct the past or to preserve heritage?
Thanks for that, Roberto. Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's also quite relevant to architectural history more broadly than the case of Jerusalem. And of course, technology is including digital reconstructions, is a double-edged sword always. Of course, it's very useful to reconstruct certain things that aren't accessible to us today, right? To analyze them and to gain a better understanding of them. But of course, that comes with major limitations when we're dealing with a place that has been lost, and maybe we have to come to terms with the idea that it has been lost, and then write about that or deal with that legacy of erasure, because it's erased for a reason as well. I think it's a complex question, and I don't think I have a particularly straightforward answer to it. But yeah, questions of how do we deal with the digital world, and especially within historical research, is quite a tricky one. I think one research project that I particularly like, it's not architectural, but it's more geographical, is something like visualizing Palestine, where, you know, there are these colonial maps that once you patch together start to give you a better sense of what was there before. And by making them digitally available, then they become accessible to people who can't either access these archives or access these locations and places. So that is an advantage of digital research and making things accessible digitally. But I think architectural research still has to be site-based, because once you're in the site, you see things very differently. You see forces of the present, but also forces of history that are otherwise obscured in virtual reality.
I guess, and I suppose that, yeah, virtual reality is fascinating because it gives us the chance to see what is no longer. But on the other hand, there are all sorts of other issues, and also the choice, what is that we want to see in that virtual reality. But as you mentioned, I too am very fascinated. There are some projects I've been following, and I'm curious to see how they're going to see the light of day at some point, and how they're going to, you know, be available. So instead of insisting in sort of fake reconstructions or appropriating the land, but just to focus on the virtual. But I understand there's also a lot of political implications connected to that. So I want to move to another area of your work, which I had the pleasure to read several times, and I know that also is some sort of shared with another scholar in different ways. So in 2019, you published a very interesting article related on the Jerusalem Quarterly, I must say, related to the Arab exhibition. So exhibitions were a feature of that time. They were very common throughout the world, certainly throughout Europe. A lot of countries used a space to exhibit their products, their arts, their several features of that particular people. And so Palestinians did the same in 1931, and that exhibition took place in Jerusalem. So I was wondering if you can tell us more about the Arab exhibition, who were the people involved, and how did it work, and whether it was successful or not.
Right. So basically, I mean, writing about the Arab Jerusalem in itself was quite a journey, because I actually stumbled upon many references to the Arab exhibition as I was working on something else entirely. So this was a complete accident in terms of that wasn't the intention. It wasn't to write about the Arab exhibition, but it kept coming up in memoirs, in newspapers, in narratives from the 1930s. And then when I tried to actually search for anything about the Arab exhibition, I realized that this episode in the history of Mandate Palestine has not been written, which really became the reason for me to write this piece. But the first reference I came across was by Isa al-Isa, who was the founder of the well-known newspaper Palestine, which was based in Jaffa. It started in the late Ottoman period and proceeded into the Mandate period. And then he writes in his memoirs, which are still unpublished, that in 1931, he goes and visits the colonial exhibition in Paris. And that exhibition is well known. Palestine is represented at that exhibition, but it's mostly a British Zionist representation. It's not a Palestinian representation. And then immediately upon his return to Palestine, he starts raising the subject of a Palestinian, similar Palestinian exhibition to be led by Palestinians, to take place originally in Jaffa, which is the city he's from. And then he starts writing because he owns a newspaper. So he has a major site where he could be heard, and then to start a really public debate around this subject. And then the idea grows. Some people join in on it. In 1932, he goes to Baghdad and visits the Iraqi agri and industrial exhibition there. So this is the 1930s is really a time when Palestinians are trying to establish themselves within a broader Arab geography, both politically and culturally, but also more importantly, economically, which is really the main spirit behind this exhibition. And he succeeds. So he's heard around Palestine. He starts a company, then the company establishes a board of directors, and they start selling shares to people from all around Palestine. So they start going on journeys to Gaza, to Ramle, to the north, to Nazareth, all around Palestine, trying to sell shares. And in fact, in 1933, the Arab exhibition does take place. It opens its doors in Jerusalem, not on Jaffa. And that's a main issue of contention that appears in the board of directors' meeting minutes. And it takes place in the Palace Hotel in Jerusalem, which is now the the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which at the time was built by the Supreme Muslim Council. And it was actually so successful that in 1934, they decided to do a second exhibition. And one of the main things about writing about the Arab exhibition was to try and see this history of Palestinians acting on their own terms. One of the compelling things would have been to read it against the 1931 exhibition, which took place in Tel Aviv, the Levant Fair, which they do mention in newspapers. They're posing this Arab exhibition as an adversary to the Zionist fair. But it's about much more than that. And that's what I tried to give justice to, which is this Arab regional connection behind something like the Arab exhibition, bringing in trades and crafts from Damascus, from all the way from North Africa to Hijaz. And that's really the spirit in which it was created.
Eventually, the Arab exhibition lasted only a few years. Was it because of the eventually the outbreak of the Arab revolt, or there are other reasons, like perhaps competition, internal competitions, particularly within the Palestinian environment, that brought the Arab exhibition to a stop?
That's a good question. Yeah, so they did do the second exhibition. A third exhibition was supposed to take place, and it was supposed to take place in Jaffa, but it did not. And I think the main hurdle was actually financial. And that problem was also there in the first and second exhibition, because they were trying to really finance this ambitious projects, but half of those who bought shares didn't pay what they had to pay. But then they decided that they needed to do it anyway for the first and second time. But it wasn't very sustainable for a third time. Now, of course, this question of finances is also very political, because the British colonial administration actually refused to finance the Arab exhibition on the grounds that it did not include the Jewish population. So originally, when it was supposed to happen in Jaffa, the Jaffa municipality was in on the project and was about to start financing the project. But then the British sort of ordered against it. So it's quite political. And then, of course, with the outbreak of the 1936 revolt, there were bigger concerns to be preoccupied with than the exhibition.
I personally found some records where Mussolini was trying to channel some money into the Arab exhibition, but he was actually supporting also the Zionist movement, particularly Jabotinsky at the same time. These ideas were mainly to fight the British in Palestine and to gain some sort of an Italian stronger presence in the region. But I guess that money was obviously not enough, which I'm not surprised, to be honest. I was wondering, in terms of the exhibition itself, what kind of objects, what kind of materials, what kind of ideas were exhibited and exchanged in these two events?
That's a great question. We're lucky enough to have two exhibition guidebooks for the 1933 and the 1934 exhibitions, with a full list of the participating either companies or individuals. And because it was an agro-industrial exhibition, that was the main goal behind the exhibition. It was mostly either light crafts or industrial products that were packaged and prepared for sale. So things like soap, like jewelry, really a wide range of objects that one could probably still find today when you go into the bazaars of many Arab cities. But mostly crafts and light industries, not heavy industries, that were exhibited. Yeah.
If you think about a potential legacy of this Arab exhibition, do you think was it understood, successful in terms of like connecting Palestine with the surrounding regions, and also particularly competing with the Zionist products in Palestine? So this idea of a competition between the two markets, which essentially the British developed, instead of bringing them together, creating two parallel systems.
It's much harder to speak of success and failure than to speak of what was intended or what was attempted, at least. I think in terms of success, things diverted soon thereafter with the 36 revolt, and things were not looking good by the start of World War II in Palestine for the Palestinians. And of course, then 48. So yeah, to speak of success is difficult. But I think the more important point is what was attempted. And it was really this attempt to bridge what was broken in World War I. These ties that could no longer be justified in administrative and geopolitical terms, but were still there sentimentally and socially and culturally. But they were trying to solidify them economically as well, to create a parallel economy outside the colonial economy that ruled greater Syria, but also the region more broadly. So that was the attempt. It's hard to call it successful. I don't think it was very successful. The fact that there wasn't a third exhibition is also another indicator that it was not very successful. But it attempted at something. It was a vision of some sort. And I think that's what's worth exploring when we explore histories like this, because so not to superimpose that deterministic eventual failure, which happened, and it's hard to contest. But what was envisioned? Yeah.
It's a fascinating story, and gladly, I must say that, like you mentioned, I saw the references in some diaries and memoirs, but I never really fully understood what it exactly was until I came across your work and another colleague of yours. And I found it interesting that you have this like kind of like people coming together, and to me, as you just said, trying to reconnect with essentially the British border, so with the Ottoman past, where regions existed, but there were no real borders, and people, not just businessmen, but people could connect in a different way. So essentially, those were not real borders other than administrative ones. And so I found it interesting that the Arab exhibition was really that attempt to rejoin and reconnect regions that had been separated after World War I. I want to bring you, for the last part of the interview, to something more recent that you wrote in 2021, an article for the Architecture Review, which, as far as I understand, also received some lot of praises and probably one of the most downloaded articles of the review itself. Under Jerusalem, Israel's subterranean expansion. And this, to me, is a fascinating topic, because for all the people visiting Jerusalem, there is an overground Jerusalem that we all can see, but we also are aware that there is an underground Jerusalem, and to an extent that is visible given previous excavation, whether it's under the Western Wall, which is probably one of the most famous one, obviously the excavation just outside the walls of the so-called Ir David. I mean, obviously we know that historically there was a seat of David there, but obviously there are much more politics connected to that kind of excavations, but also excavations around Silwan, other parts of Sheikh Jarrah and other Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. So your argument is that archaeology is essentially used as a justification for subterranean colonial expansion. And I found this intriguing and fascinating, because there is very little talk about this further development. You know, it's easier to talk the overground city, obviously the question of Sheikh Jarrah, but there is a second battle, and that battle is fought underground.
Yeah, so this article was part of an issue that was dedicated to the question of the underground that the Architectural Review published in 2021. And it's really about exploring not only the things that we see, and you know, when it comes to architecture, usually we look at what is visible, but to really look at the foundations of artifacts, of buildings, of cities, right? And to really dig deeper into the terrains that hold up these cities. And of course, when it comes to Jerusalem, we have a longer history of interest in the underground of Jerusalem. I mean, in this article, it's a short article, but it's also a survey of some of these interests, and it goes all the way back from medieval depictions of underground Jerusalem as, you know, the chamber leading into the lowest levels of hell, into a more contemporary and current politics around digging in Jerusalem. But the modern legacy of interest, of colonial interest in underground Jerusalem, starts with the British, but before the British period. So it starts with British colonial interests in Palestine already in the late Ottoman period, in the late 19th century. And it's only until later that really Jewish excavators join these efforts. It's only until 1911 or 1912, if I'm correct, that lay the foundations for what later becomes the Israel what is it? The Israel archaeological. I have to, yeah.
Authority.
Yeah, something like that. But it's something similar to the Palestine Exploration Fund, but that's Zionist run. But yeah, so it's really the Palestine Exploration fund that starts these underground diggings. Charles Warren, who's a British archaeologist, comes to Palestine. He's a big fan of the Zionist movement, but he's also quite dedicated to digging under to Jerusalem, to the extent that he's willing to really go very deep into the ground, risk his own life and the life of staff that he hired. And then this underground Jerusalem becomes a fascination in the late 19th century. Tourists start to come specifically to Jerusalem to go into these tours that Warren himself is leading into the underground. A lot of people are interested in it. There's also an exhibition that's held in London called Under Jerusalem, of paintings of underground Jerusalem. So it really starts with that legacy. But of course, it extends to the creation of Israel in 1948, and more importantly, after 67 and the occupation of East Jerusalem, when the digging really starts to take in a new life. And of course, that coincides with the demolition of the Mughrabi quarter, which really leaves room for more digging near Haram Sharif. And of course, the story today is well known. You know, I mean, you go to Jerusalem today and there are still tours of underground Jerusalem. There's a lot of projects for building cemeteries, for building, essentially, it's an entire city under the city today. And that, of course, is not innocent and is very politicized, because usually to be living in Silwan or Sheikh Jarrah or in the old city today, if you're a Palestinian, one of your biggest fears would be for someone to knock on your door and tell you, we're here to look into what's under your house. So the matter is really sensitive and really political. But it does have legacies that go back to the 19th century, if we're talking about the modern colonial legacy of digging in Jerusalem.
Digging is certainly connected also with the other interesting aspect of digging, which is bulldozing. And I found it fascinating from one perspective to look at these terms, but also extremely problematic, because this is real. In order to dig in Jerusalem, you have to bulldoze the actual buildings that stand over that area. And that brings me to one question related to your work as an architect. To what extent you think architecture and your role as an architect may be influential in not suggesting future solutions for Jerusalem, but contributing to possible solutions? I know it's a $1 million question.
Certainly is. I think architects are generally, the drive of architects is to build. And in a place like Jerusalem, a lot of the building comes at the cost of destruction, because today there's little room to build, right? When in a very dense city like Jerusalem. So to build, you have to destroy. And that duality is never, I mean, it's almost inescapable today. I think one of the things that architects should do is to try and fight this urge sometimes. That before building or destroying, to pause and try to understand what actually happened. How did we get here? What is this built fabric? What are the legacies that we still live today? How does it affect the lives of the residents of these cities? I think these questions are essential for architects to ask, because, I mean, none of this none of this construction or destruction comes without a cost. And I'm not saying that architects should just be pessimistic or abandon their roles. I think there's a big role to be played by architects and by planners. But I think one of the things that we need to learn is to be a little humble and to ask questions before we actually pose our own interventions into built environments and into the lived environments of entire populations. And I think that's been a long-standing problem when it comes to Palestine, that architects have been too arrogant to ask these questions or take into consideration the interests of local Palestinian inhabitants.
I guess people follow their passions and sometimes they don't really realize the consequences. But I asked that question because I noticed that there's been a growing movement of architects, particularly in Israel, and Israeli architects. They have become more and more engaged in civil society and trying to bring civil society to rethink this drive. Given the fact that obviously Israel is this country where buildings are built every day and they emerge rather quickly. And the same can be said up to a point in Palestine. Obviously, there are different restrictions, but when you drive now from Jerusalem to Ramallah is this constant line of buildings. So I think it's like it's a general trend, building. I have one last question, and very much is about what I didn't ask and you want to talk about. Is there anything since the interview took one specific direction that I didn't ask, but you want to talk about?
Not particularly, but I think, I mean, regarding your last point, I think as Palestinian architects, we really operate from a very different vantage point than those of Israeli architects. I mean, we see Israeli architects as part of the problem, and as progressive as one tries to be within, a colonial structure, I don't think that there's much that architects can do. I think the issue is extremely political first and foremost, and then architecture is a subset of that. But there are initiatives a lot among Palestinian architects to try and rethink our own heritage, including Jerusalem, but also Palestine more broadly. And I think, yeah, it's time for us to try and think collectively about these things and critically. And one of the starting points is to start and look at our own architectural heritage, but also at the architectural present as also a key problem to take into consideration before essentially going on as professionals and proceeding with our daily lives as usual. So yeah, I think that's just my comment on that last bit.
This was Nadi Abusaada, currently a Aga Khan postdoctoral fellow at Islamic Architecture and Urbanism at MIT, author of several articles, and I just want to mention two: The Arab Exhibition, 1931-34, published by the Jerusalem Quarterly, and Under Jerusalem, recently published in the Architectural Review, just to be more precise. Nadi, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.